A few weeks ago, I was walking, not anywhere in particular, just moving through a part of the city I hadn't passed through in a while. And then, it was just there. My childhood school, the same gate, the same low wall I used to sit on while waiting for my mother. The same trees, taller now, which I suppose makes sense, but still, it was strange to see them grown. I stopped. I didn't plan to. The body just paused. And then something began to happen that I wasn't entirely in charge of. The brain started playing back things I hadn't thought about in years. Not in a list, not in order, more like a film that cuts between scenes without asking permission. Particular afternoon in class, the smell of chalk dust and the specific kind of boredom that only exists when you're 8 years old and the clock is moving wrong. A friend's laugh. The way the courtyard looked in winter when we would breathe out and watch our breath disappear. And I stood there, on a pavement in the middle of a weekday, with my eyes watering. I couldn't tell you what I was feeling. I genuinely couldn't. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't happiness either. It was something with no clean name. Something that sat in the chest like a full cup, like you could tip it either way, and it would spill differently depending on the angle. I remember thinking, what is this? Not with distress, just with actual honest curiosity. What is my body doing right now, and why? That question is what led me here. To this video, to this night. Welcome to The Sleepy Biologist, and if you found your way back after last time, or if this is your first night settling in with one of these, either way, I'm glad the space exists. It exists partly because of the people who support this channel, who leave kind words in the comments, or hit the like button quietly without thinking much of it, or who've joined as members and kept the light on in here. I notice all of it, more than I probably say. Tonight we're going to move slowly through something the body does, something it's been doing, in one form or another, for as long as human beings have had memory. A feeling that arrives without being summoned, that pulls at something old that feels somehow simultaneously warm and painful in the same breath. There is a word for it now, a relatively new one, all things considered. Nostalgia. It was written down for the first time in 1688, barely 3.5 centuries ago, by a Swiss medical student named Johannes Hofer. He wasn't describing a feeling people had just discovered. He was trying to give clinical shape to something soldiers were dying of, or at least something doctors believed was killing them. The symptoms recorded at the time: obsessive thoughts, weeping without occasion, loss of appetite, insomnia, a kind of wasting that seemed to come from the inside out. Hofer built the word from 2 Greek roots: nostos, homecoming, algos, pain, homecoming pain. That's where this thing started, not as poetry, as a medical diagnosis. There's something worth sitting with there, the idea that for a long time the longing for the past was classified as an illness. Not a mood, not a memory, not a feature of consciousness. A disease, one that could, in serious cases, be fatal. We're obviously well past that now, but I find it interesting, and I tend to think it's worth noticing, that the first instinct was to call it damage, because it doesn't feel like damage, does it? Even when it hurts, even when it makes your eyes water outside a school gate on a Tuesday morning. It feels like something the body is doing, not something that's happening to it. The brain reaching backward is not a random event. When you encounter something, a place, a smell, a fragment of a song, that pulls memory forward, what's actually occurring is a sudden coordinated activation across multiple regions of neural tissue. Not one place lighting up, but several simultaneously in conversation with each other. The hippocampus, which has been quietly archiving the story of your life since before you could speak, begins to retrieve. The amygdala, a structure that has very little interest in logic and a great deal of interest in emotional weight, responds. And somewhere in the deeper brain, in structures we associate with reward, with hunger, with the particular pull of things we've learned to find meaningful, something stirs. These activations don't occur in sequence. That's one of the things that makes this feeling so unusual. It's not first the memory, then the emotion. It seems to be both at once. The retrieval and the feeling are co-occurring, threaded together in a way that makes them difficult to separate. Which might be why, when you try to describe what nostalgia feels like, you end up saying things like bittersweet, because the bitter and the sweet are not happening one after the other. They are genuinely happening at the same time. Your body knows how to hold contradictory signals, more than you might expect. There is something that still isn't fully understood about this. And I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. We have good neuroimaging data, we have behavioral research, we have decades of psychological study, and yet the exact mechanism by which nostalgia generates its particular texture, that ache that isn't quite pain, that warmth that isn't quite comfort, isn't entirely pinned down. The brain regions involved are identified, what they're doing together, and why this specific combination produces this specific feeling rather than something else entirely, remains, at the edges, genuinely open. I find that comforting, actually, a strange word for it, but there's something that feels right about the idea that this experience, which has been with humans since before anyone named it, still resists full explanation. The word disease did not survive. By the late 19th century, nostalgia had begun drifting away from medicine. Other terms absorbed the pathological end of things: homesickness for the spatial longing, depression for the kind of backward-reaching sadness that genuinely destabilizes. What was left over, what nostalgia came to describe, was something less clinical and more pervasive. A recurring visitor, something that arrives in an ordinary moment, outside a school, hearing a chord catching an unexpected smell on the air, and does something to the body that is neither simple nor easy to dismiss. It arrives between 1 and 3 times a week on average, in most adults, not during dramatic occasions, during ordinary ones, while doing dishes, while driving, while lying still in the dark. It's happening to a lot of people right now, somewhere in this moment. What you felt if you've ever stood somewhere and felt the past come back, not as thought but as weight, as something in the sternum behind the eyes, that is the brain doing something it has been built to do, malfunctioning, not indulging, uprooting, reaching into stored experience and pulling it forward into the body's present tense chemistry. And the reason it doesn't feel clean, the reason it feels like both things at once, has to do with which systems are involved. The reward circuits are part of this. The memory systems are part of this. The emotional regulation structures are part of this. They don't take turns, and that mixture, that simultaneous warm and aching quality, is not a glitch in the processing. It seems to be in some way the point. What the body does next, how it generates that sensation, what dopamine has to do with it, how the hippocampus and the reward system ended up in such close conversation, is something we'll move into slowly. There's no rush. The night is long enough. There is a structure in the brain, roughly the shape and size of a cashew, curved inward, sitting on each side of the head about level with the ears, and it has been doing something remarkable, in the most ordinary, unremarkable way, every moment of your life. The hippocampus, most people have heard the name. Fewer think about what it's actually doing right now at this hour while the room is dark and the body is still and the breath is moving slowly in and out without being asked to. It's filing things, not dramatically, not with any particular urgency. It's taking the residue of today, conversations, temperatures, textures, the emotional valence of small moments you've already half forgotten, and it's threading them into long-term storage. Doing what it has done every night of your life, you don't feel it. There's no sensation that corresponds to consolidation. It just happens, underneath everything, like a quiet administrative process that never once asked for acknowledgement. But here's what I keep returning to, and I'm not sure I have the full shape of it yet. The hippocampus doesn't work alone. Running beneath and alongside it is a pathway so tightly integrated into the brain's reward system that these two are sometimes discussed as a single loop, the hippocampal VTA loop. VTA stands for ventral tegmental area, a small cluster of neurons buried in the midbrain that produces and distributes dopamine. Not all the brain's dopamine, but a significant portion of the kind that moves through circuits involved in motivation, in learning, in the pull toward things the brain has decided are worth pursuing. These two structures, one built for memory, one built for reward, talk to each other constantly, and the nature of their conversation is not what you might expect. The hippocampus can trigger the VTA, Memory retrieval, the simple act of pulling something out of storage, can activate dopamine release. Not always, not for every memory, but for certain ones, under certain conditions, the retrieval itself produces a response in the reward system that mirrors, in its chemistry, the response you'd get from something happening now, in the present, that your brain considers meaningful. Think about what that means for a moment. The brain does not always cleanly distinguish between remembering something good and experiencing something good. There's a 2016 neuroimaging study published in the journal Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience out of Japan, where researchers showed participants images from their childhoods while measuring brain activity. Images designed to evoke nostalgia. And what they found wasn't one region activating in response to memory. It was two systems firing in coordination, the hippocampus and the ventral striatum, a reward processing region that receives dopamine from the VTA, activating together, their co-activation correlating directly with how nostalgic participants reported feeling, not sequentially, together, as if the feeling of nostalgia required both simultaneously in order to exist at all, which seems, when you sit with it, intuitively right, because nostalgia doesn't feel like remembering. It feels like wanting something you're already touching, a strange doubling. The memory is present, you're in it, at least partially, and yet there is also this resisting quality, this sense of distance from the very thing that feels close. That tension is real, and the loop between hippocampus and reward system seems to be generating it, or at least sustaining it, in ways we're still unpacking. Dopamine is often described as the pleasure chemical. That's technically imprecise. What dopamine actually tracks, at least in the circuits we're discussing, is something closer to anticipated value. It responds to prediction more than outcome. It fires when the brain recognizes a pattern that has previously led to something meaningful, before the reward arrives, sometimes long before. This is partly why certain songs, particularly songs from adolescence, which we'll come back to later, can produce a dopamine response before the chorus even arrives. The brain has learned the song, it anticipates the part that matters, and the anticipation itself carries the chemistry. Now apply that to memory. When a nostalgic memory surfaces, when something in the environment triggers the hippocampus to pull forward a stored experience, the brain's reward circuitry begins responding not to the present moment but to the pattern, to the emotional signature of what this memory has meant before. Every time this memory has been retrieved, it has arrived with a certain feeling. The VTA has learned that. It responds accordingly. Each retrieval, in a small but measurable way, reinforces the loop. The memory becomes more tightly associated with its reward value. The next retrieval is slightly warmer than the last. This is not nostalgia getting out of hand, it's learning. It's the hippocampal VTA loop doing exactly what it evolved to do, strengthening the connections between things that have proven emotionally significant, keeping them accessible, keeping them warm. What I find most arresting about this, and I say arresting because it genuinely stopped me when I first read the research, is the implication that nostalgia might be in part a form of the brain practicing care, not indulgence, care. The systematic maintenance of emotional memory, the routine retrieval and re-encoding of experiences that have been flagged somewhere in the system as mattering. Whether or not that's the right framing, I'm not certain, but it's the one that feels most honest to what the data suggests. The brain isn't dragging you into the past because it's malfunctioning or because it's trying to make you sad. It's revisiting, reinforcing, keeping something alive that it has, through years of repeated experience, decided is worth keeping. There is a second component to what happens in the reward system during nostalgia, and it has to do with a structure called the substantia nigra, a region adjacent to the VTA, also dopaminergic, associated with learning, movement, and salience. Research by Frederick Barrett, published around the same period, showed that music-evoked nostalgia changed the metabolic activity in the substantia nigra specifically. Not just reward broadly, this particular node in the dopamine architecture, the one involved in detecting what's significant enough to remember, was responding to emotionally familiar music in ways it doesn't respond to music that is merely pleasant. There's a distinction there. Mere pleasantness doesn't do this. Familiar emotional significance does, which is why nostalgia can't be manufactured simply by making something agreeable. It requires history. It requires that the brain has already been through something, that the experience has already been stored, already been retrieved before, already accumulated some emotional weight. The loop can't activate for a memory that doesn't exist. It needs the archive to be real. Somewhere in the body right now, this loop is resting. The hippocampus is doing its quiet nighttime work. The VTA is not particularly active. Sleep changes the whole dopaminergic landscape, quiets some circuits, allows others to do their maintenance. But the connections forged today, the ones that have been running since childhood, the associations between certain stored experiences and their reward value, those are here, woven into the tissue, unchanged by the hour, and when morning comes, or when something on an ordinary street catches the edge of a memory you haven't thought about in years, the loop will do what it does. The hippocampus will reach, the striatum will respond, the dopamine will move through its pathways, and you will feel for a moment the strange chemistry of a thing that is both past and present, both real and unreachable, both at the same time. The question that follows naturally, the one that starts to pull at the edges of this, is not just which chemicals are involved, but what the memory itself is made of by the time it arrives, because what you retrieve, it turns out, is not quite what was stored. The brain has been doing something to it, quietly, over all the years in between. I've started hesitating outside certain places, not in a dramatic way, more like the body slows before the mind decides to, a street I used to walk every day as a child. The road that leads past a house I haven't been inside in maybe 15 years. A particular park with a particular smell in the mornings, especially when it's damp. I'll be heading somewhere, moving at a normal pace, and then something will register, a visual, a smell, the angle of a building against a sky, and the feet slow down before I've made any conscious decision. I know what will happen if I go in, or past, or even just close. The memories will come, not as thoughts, that's not quite the right word for it, more as a sudden re-inhabiting, like the body briefly forgets which year it is. And here's what I find hard to articulate. It's not that I don't want that, it's that I want it too much. The remembering feels good in a way that immediately aches, because the moments come back vivid and complete and utterly untouchable. And somewhere in the chest there is this craving, not a light one, to not just remember them, but to be back inside them. To be 8 years old in that park again. To hear the voices that belong to those memories. To live inside what is now only a retrieval. That craving doesn't go away when the memory does. It lingers. I think a lot of people know this feeling and don't quite have words for it either. Here's what the biology says about why the memory arrives the way it does, and it starts somewhere older than nostalgia, older than memory as we usually think of it. The amygdala. 2 of them, actually. Almond-shaped clusters, the name comes from the Greek for almond, sitting deep in the temporal lobe, one on each side. They are old structures. Evolutionarily old, they were doing their work long before the prefrontal cortex developed the capacity for reflection or language, or the kind of thinking that lets you decide to hesitate outside a gate. Their job, reduced to something blunt, flag what matters emotionally, fast. When something happens that carries emotional charge, fear, joy, grief, the particular warmth of being held by someone who loves you, the amygdala responds immediately, tagging the experience with a kind of intensity marker. It doesn't wait to understand what's happening. It responds to the emotional signal and marks the memory accordingly, signaling to the hippocampus that this one should be held differently, encoded more deeply, kept somewhere more accessible. The more intense the emotional charge at the moment of encoding, the more durable the memory tends to be. This is why childhood memories, the ones that return in nostalgia, are so often disproportionately vivid. Not because childhood was more photographically real than adulthood, but because you are experiencing much of it for the first time. First times carry higher emotional charge. Higher charge means stronger amygdala response. Stronger amygdala response means deeper encoding. The hippocampus held those memories tighter because the amygdala told it to. But, and this is the part that changes everything about how nostalgia feels, what comes back is not what was stored. Not exactly. Memory is not a recording. This is stated often, but I'm not sure it fully lands until you try to apply it to something personal. The brain does not preserve experiences the way video preserves footage. What it stores are the components, emotional tone, sensory fragments, social context, a general shape of what occurred, and what it retrieves is a reconstruction. The brain takes those components and reassembles them in the moment of remembering, which means every retrieval is in a small way a new act of creation. And here is where the amygdala quietly does something that shapes nostalgia's particular emotional texture. Over time, the negative components of a memory decay faster than the positive ones. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the difficult parts, the boredom, the minor cruelties, the ordinary unhappiness woven into even a beloved childhood, these fade at a slightly faster rate. What persists, what the amygdala keeps most accessible, skews warm. You're not misremembering, the system is just selective, not dishonestly. It's doing what it was built to do, which is prioritize the emotionally significant over the emotionally neutral, and over time the positively charged tends to outlast the negatively charged in long-term retrieval. Researcher Krystine Batcho, who has spent decades studying autobiographical memory and nostalgia specifically, described this once in terms that I found oddly clarifying. She noted that if women remembered childbirth with complete accuracy, most wouldn't want to do it again. The selective softening of memory isn't a flaw. It seems, in some cases, to be functionally necessary, a way of keeping the past livable, keeping it something you can revisit without being undone. The brain is not protecting you from truth. It's managing what truth does to the body over time. So when you stand outside a place you used to know, when you hesitate on that pavement, like I sometimes do, what your brain offers you is real but curated. The memory that arrives has been through something. The amygdala marked it as significant when it was formed. The hippocampus held it. And over the years between then and now, the system has quietly done its editing. The version that returns is warmer than the original, more golden, if you'll allow that word once, more complete feeling than the experience actually was, which is part of why the craving is so difficult. Because you are not craving the actual past. You're craving this version, this reconstructed, softened, emotionally intensified version, which never quite existed in the form it now appears. The past you want to return to is partly a product of the remembering itself. That gap between what was lived and what is retrieved is not something you can cross, not because time only moves forward, but because the destination has been changed by the journey of remembering it. And yet the craving persists. The chest does what it does. There's a quality to it. I find this hard to explain clinically, where the longing isn't quite painful and isn't quite pleasurable. It sits in between. The amygdala is doing its part, the hippocampal vita-A loop is doing its part. Dopamine is moving through the circuitry that learned long ago that these memories carry value. And the body responds as though reaching towards something real, because to the brain it is real. The retrieval is real. The emotional signal is real. The distinction between present tense experience and remembered experience is not something the reward circuitry is particularly careful about honoring. The body doesn't fully know you're only remembering. Part of it responds as though you are there. This might be why certain places feel almost too much, why you slow down before you've decided to, why the gate of an old school or the smell of a particular park can feel like standing at the edge of something large. The amygdala holds what happened there. The reconstruction machinery is ready. The loop between memory and reward is primed by proximity, a smell, a visual, an ambient sound, and the whole system begins preparing to retrieve before you've consciously registered what's coming. The hesitation is not weakness. It's the nervous system knowing from experience how much this costs. Not pain, not damage, just weight. The weight of something that mattered, returning in a form that is close to the original but cannot be the original, cannot be touched or entered or stayed inside, only visited and then released. What happens inside that release, what the brain does in the seconds and minutes after a nostalgic wave passes, leads somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that has less to do with the past and more to do with why the body reaches for this feeling in the first place. What function this serves, what the present moment is usually lacking when nostalgia arrives uninvited. The answer is less obvious than it seems. And here is where the amygdala quietly does something that shapes nostalgia's particular emotional texture. Over time, the negative components of a memory decay faster than the positive ones. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the difficult parts, the boredom, the minor cruelties, the ordinary unhappiness woven into even a beloved childhood, these fade at a slightly faster rate. What persists, what the amygdala keeps most accessible, skews warm. You're not misremembering, the system is just selective, not dishonestly. It's doing what it was built to do, which is prioritize the emotionally significant over the emotionally neutral, and over time the positively charged tends to outlast the negatively charged in long-term retrieval. Researcher Krystine Batcho, who has spent decades studying autobiographical memory and nostalgia specifically, described this once in terms that I found oddly clarifying. She noted that if women remembered childbirth with complete accuracy, most wouldn't want to do it again. The selective softening of memory isn't a flaw. It seems, in some cases, to be functionally necessary, a way of keeping the past livable, keeping it something you can revisit without being undone. The brain is not protecting you from truth. It's managing what truth does to the body over time. So when you stand outside a place you used to know, when you hesitate on that pavement, like I sometimes do, what your brain offers you is real but curated. The memory that arrives has been through something. The amygdala marked it as significant when it was formed. The hippocampus held it. And over the years between then and now, the system has quietly done its editing. The version that returns is warmer than the original. More golden, if you'll allow that word once, more complete feeling than the experience actually was, which is part of why the craving is so difficult. Because you are not craving the actual past. You're craving this version, this reconstructed, softened, emotionally intensified version, which never quite existed in the form it now appears. The past you want to return to is partly a product of the remembering itself. That gap between what was lived and what is retrieved is not something you can cross, not because time only moves forward, but because the destination has been changed by the journey of remembering it. And yet the craving persists. The chest does what it does. There's a quality to it. I find this hard to explain clinically, where the longing isn't quite painful and isn't quite pleasurable. It sits in between. The amygdala is doing its part, the hippocampal vita-A loop is doing its part. Dopamine is moving through the circuitry that learned long ago that these memories carry value. And the body responds as though reaching towards something real, because to the brain it is real. The retrieval is real. The emotional signal is real. The distinction between present tense experience and remembered experience is not something the reward circuitry is particularly careful about honoring. The body doesn't fully know you're only remembering. Part of it responds as though you are there. This might be why certain places feel almost too much, why you slow down before you've decided to, why the gate of an old school or the smell of a particular park can feel like standing at the edge of something large. The amygdala holds what happened there. The reconstruction machinery is ready. The loop between memory and reward is primed by proximity, a smell, a visual, an ambient sound, and the whole system begins preparing to retrieve before you've consciously registered what's coming. The hesitation is not weakness. It's the nervous system knowing from experience how much this costs. Not pain, not damage, just weight. The weight of something that mattered, returning in a form that is close to the original but cannot be the original, cannot be touched or entered or stayed inside, only visited and then released. What happens inside that release, What the brain does in the seconds and minutes after a nostalgic wave passes leads somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that has less to do with the past and more to do with why the body reaches for this feeling in the first place. What function this serves, what the present moment is usually lacking when nostalgia arrives uninvited. The answer is less obvious than it seems. There's an evolutionary story here. Loose, speculative at the edges, I want to be clear about that, but structurally sound. The brain developed long before central heating, long before the reliable availability of shelter and warmth. In conditions where physical cold represented genuine threat, a system that could partially buffer against cold by retrieving the memory of warmth, of safety, of the specific sensory texture of a protected place, might have made the difference between stopping and continuing. Tim Wildschut's team raised exactly this possibility. If remembering the warmth of a previously known safe place could trick the nervous system into tolerating just a few more degrees of cold, just a slightly longer stretch of exposure, then the mechanism would have been worth keeping. It would persist. It would be built in. Whether that's the origin story or not, and we can't know, not really, the effect is documented. Nostalgia warms the body, measurably, literally, not as metaphor, as physiology. What I keep returning to, and I'm still not entirely sure what to do with this, is the intimacy of it. The idea that the brain holds past warmth as a resource, that it files away not just what happened, not just who was there, not just the emotional quality of a memory, but something closer to its thermal signature, the felt temperature of a specific time and place, the kitchen where someone made you something warm to eat, a particular afternoon indoors when it was raining, the specific body heat of sleeping next to someone you trusted. These are not abstract recollections, they left a physical imprint. And the brain, when the present moment is cold enough, can reach for them, uses them. The insula is part of this, a folded region of cortex buried in the lateral sulcus, involved in introception, the brain's perception of the body's internal state. Temperature, hunger, pain, the felt sense of what is happening inside the skin. The insula processes thermal information and integrates it with emotional context. When nostalgia activates, insular activity changes. The emotional memory and the physical sensation are processed in overlapping circuitry. The warmth of the memory and the sensation of warmth in the body are not as separable as you might expect. The brain does not draw a clean line between remembered temperature and felt temperature. Not always. I think about this on cold nights specifically. The way the body, unasked, tends to drift towards certain memories when the temperature drops. Not dramatic ones, small ones, ordinary warm ones, a particular blanket, a particular time of year, nothing grand. And now I find it hard to dismiss that as coincidence. Or as simple comfort seeking, because the data suggests something more specific than that, something that looks less like sentimentality and more like a regulatory system doing its job, reaching for warmth in the form of memory the way the body reaches for warmth in the form of circulation, pulling resources inward, managing the cold. The night does something to the body that the day doesn't. The temperature drops, the room gets quieter, and somewhere in the processing of all of that, the past becomes slightly more available. Which makes what happens next, the question of when nostalgia tends to arrive, and what the present moment is usually missing when it does, feel less like psychology and more like plumbing, less like a mood and more like a pressure system. Something the body reaches for when a particular kind of deficiency opens up. Not just cold, other kinds of absence too. Evening is its own thing, not night. Night has a different quality, heavier, more final. Evening is the in-between, the light going amber and then gone, the sounds of the day thinning out. And if you're alone in a room during that particular shift, not because something bad has happened, just because that's how the evening went, there is a specific quality as to the solitude that I find hard to name precisely. It isn't loneliness exactly, or not always. It's more like spaciousness, a sudden availability of interior space that the day, with its noise and motion and demands, had been filling without you noticing. And when the day stops filling it, something else moves in. Memory, not invited, not decided on, just there, the way water finds whatever space it's given. I know this particular evening feeling well. My room, the light from outside changing, no particular reason to be sad, no crisis, just alone. And even if I'm in the middle of something, even if I'd rather not go there, the mind starts moving backward, unprompted, pulling people forward from years ago, moments that have no obvious connection to the present, an afternoon with cousins I haven't seen in a long time, a meal at a table that no longer exists in the same form, voices. Some of those people are still in the world, some are not. That distinction matters enormously when the memory arrives. My grandfather was a funny man. I want to say that plainly without dressing it up. He was genuinely funny, not in a performed way, not in the way someone is funny when they're trying to be, just naturally. The kind of person who could make a whole room laugh without raising their voice, who found the absurd thing in ordinary situations and pointed at it so gently that you laughed before you'd even understood what you were laughing at. Being around him had a particular feeling, a looseness, a sense that whatever you were worried about was probably not as serious as you'd made it. He has been gone for some years now, and in the evenings sometimes he comes back, not as a thought I have chosen to have, as a retrieval, his face specific and real, the sound of his laugh, but which I can still hear actually, which I find strange and also not strange at all. A particular gesture he had, the way he sat in a specific chair. The brain kept all of it. This is where the biology becomes something more than interesting to me. It becomes something I have a personal stake in understanding. The brain, over the course of knowing someone, months, years, decades, builds an extraordinarily detailed neural representation of that person. Not a photo, not a file. Distributed pattern of activation across multiple systems. The face recognition networks in the fusiform gyrus, the voice processing pathways in the temporal lobe, the emotional associations stored through repeated amygdala encoding, the reward circuitry that learned over thousands of small interactions that this particular person's presence meant something good. All of that learning persists. When someone dies, the neural architecture that represented them does not dissolve. The connections remain, the learned associations remain, the circuitry that fired when they walked into a room is still there, intact, with nowhere to go. This is not a metaphor for grief. It is grief. At least partly, the brain carrying a fully built representation of someone who is no longer available to activate it in real time. In the evenings, when the day's stimulation fades, the default mode network becomes more active. This is the network involved in self-referential thought, mind-wandering autobiographical memory. It is more dominant when you are not focusing on a task. When the room is quiet and the screen is dark and there is nothing pulling your attention outward. The memories that surface in this state are not random. Research on spontaneous memory retrieval, the kind that happens without deliberate effort, the kind that just arrives, suggests these memories tend to be emotionally significant, socially rich, and disproportionately drawn from periods of the past with high personal importance. The brain, given freedom to wander, wanders toward what it learned to care about, toward people, almost always toward people. Constantine Sedikides and Tim Wildschut, whose work on nostalgia has been consistent across 2 decades of research, found in repeated studies that nostalgic memories almost universally feature other people. The self is present, usually as protagonist, but the memory is structured around social connection, around belonging, around the specific texture of being in the presence of someone who mattered. This is, they argue, not coincidental. Nostalgia appears to be partly a social regulation mechanism. When the brain detects a deficit, a feeling of disconnection, of isolation, of loneliness, whether chosen or unchosen, it reaches for memories that carry the emotional signature of connection. Not to make you hate, to remind the nervous system of what connection has felt like. To produce at a chemical level something adjacent to the feeling of not being alone. The brain using memory to address a present tense need. Using the people you've known, the living and the dead, as a resource for the now. There is something I find both comforting and difficult about that framing. Comforting because it suggests the brain has not forgotten, that the people who shaped you are still, in some structural sense, inside you. The neural patterns that learn their faces and voices and laughs are not erased by their absence. They are held, kept accessible. The brain runs its retrieval and they appear specific, real, complete in all the ways that a general memory of a person I loved could never be. Difficult because the retrieval produces the feeling of their presence without the presence itself. And the gap between those two things, between the neural pattern firing and the actual person not being there, is where the particular sadness of this kind of nostalgia lives. Not grief entirely, something adjacent to it, something that sits between gratitude and loss without settling in either direction. My grandfather's laugh is still in my nervous system, literally, not as a recording but as a learned pattern. The auditory cortex processed his voice thousands of times. The amygdala tagged those moments with warmth. The reward circuitry learned to associate his presence with something it has categorized, somewhere below conscious thought, as good. All of that sits in the tissue, unchanged by his absence. When the evening gets quiet and the mind starts wandering, the default mode network does what it does. It retrieves what it has learned to value, and sometimes what it retrieves is a version of him sitting in that chair, finding something funny in something ordinary, making the room feel bigger and lighter than it was. I don't try to stop it. I'm not sure I'd want to, even if I could. But I want to be honest about what it does to the body, because I think this matters and because I notice it, and I suspect you might recognize it too. The retrieval is warm, genuinely warm. There is something in the chest that responds to it, the hippocampal VTA loop doing its work, dopamine moving through circuits that learned his presence carried value, and for a moment the room feels less empty than it did, and then the warmth carries its other edge. Because the circuit fires, the memory arrives, the emotional signal says this person, this warmth, this specific laugh, and there is nowhere for that signal to go. The brain reaches and there is nothing to reach into. The pattern is present, the person isn't. That's the ache, not a dramatic one. A quiet, persistent, very ordinary ache that sits in the evening alongside everything else, that arrives without asking, that the brain produces not to harm you, but because it is doing exactly what it should be doing, retrieving what it learned to love, presenting it to the body as evidence that connection has been real. It has been real. That's the part worth holding on to, I think, even when the rest is hard. What the research adds, and I want to end here because it feels important, is that this retrieval, this kind of nostalgic longing that is specifically for people, specifically for ones who are gone, tends to do something that initially seems counterintuitive. It doesn't deepen isolation, it buffers against it. Studies measuring loneliness before and after nostalgia induction consistently show the same pattern. The nostalgic recall of social connection reduces the subjective feeling of being alone, even when the person is physically isolated, even when the people in the memory are no longer living. The neural signature of connection, even a retrieved, reconstructed past tense one, is enough to shift the chemistry. Not completely, not permanently, but measurably. The brain using what it remembers to soften what is missing, which is not nothing, which is in its quiet way a form of the past looking after you. But there is a question that hasn't been asked yet, one that cuts underneath all of this. Not who the brain reaches for when loneliness opens up, but why now? Why this moment? Why the evening? Why the cold day? What is actually happening in the present that makes the past suddenly available? Because it turns out nostalgia is not random. It is triggered, reliably, by specific conditions. And one of those conditions, the most reliable of all, involves something the brain produces not from memory, but from anticipation. Before the chorus arrives, something has already happened in the brain. You know this feeling, maybe not by name, but you know it. A song begins, 4 notes, maybe 5, an opening phrase you've heard so many times it has worn a groove somewhere inside you. And before the song has done anything, before the part you love has arrived, there is already something, a kind of leaning forward, a subtle change in the chest, in the quality of attention. The body orienting itself toward what it knows is coming. That response, that early pre-arrival response, is dopamine, not as a reward, as a prediction. This is the part of dopamine's behavior that took neuroscience some time to understand, and that still feels, when you sit with it, slightly wrong in the best way. The intuitive model of dopamine is that it arrives after something good happens. Pleasure chemical, reward signal, you eat something delicious, dopamine releases, you feel good. Clean sequence, cause, then effect. But that's not quite what it does, or not only what it does. In the circuits we're discussing, the mesolimbic pathway, the dopaminergic projections from the ventral tegmental area into the striatum and prefrontal cortex, dopamine fires in anticipation. It responds to the prediction of reward more reliably than to the reward itself. The brain learns through repeated experience that a particular cue reliably precedes something meaningful. And once that association is learned, the dopamine response shifts. It moves earlier in the sequence. It attaches itself to the cue rather than the outcome. The opening notes of a song you love, the smell of a place you've been, the first frame of a memory beginning to surface. These are cues. And if the brain has learnt that these cues reliably precede something that carries emotional significance, the dopamine moves to meet them before they've finished arriving. Wolfram Schultz, a neuroscientist who spent years studying dopamine neurons in primates, documented this with a precision that changed how the field thought about reward. His subjects were trained to expect a reward, a drop of juice, after a specific cue. Initially, the dopamine neurons fired when the juice arrived. As training progressed and the association solidified, the firing shifted. The neurons began responding to the cue instead of the juice. When the juice arrived on schedule, the dopamine neurons had already fired and returned to baseline. When the juice failed to arrive after the cue, when the prediction was violated, the neurons dipped below baseline, a negative signal, a marking of unmet expectation. The brain runs on prediction. It generates dopamine not as a record of what happened, but as a continuously updated guess about what is coming. And when the guess is right, when the expected thing arrives, there is a brief, quiet satisfaction. When the guess is wrong, something more unsettling moves through the circuitry. Now fold this into nostalgia. The brain has spent years, in some cases decades, building associations between certain sensory inputs and certain emotional experiences. A specific song encodes not just melody but context. Who you were when you heard it first, the emotional state of that period, the social texture of the time. A smell encodes a season, a house, a particular version of your life. Over years of repeated retrieval, these associations have been reinforced. The cue has been paired with its emotional payload so many times that the dopamine response has moved almost entirely into the cue itself, which means, and this is the part I keep returning to, the part I find strange and clarifying in equal measure. By the time you are consciously aware of feeling nostalgic, the dopamine has often already fired. The prediction has already been made. The brain recognized the cue, generated its anticipatory response, and sent the signal before your attention had fully registered what was happening. The feeling arrives before you've noticed what caused it. There is a study by Frederick Barrett, published in 2016 in Neuropsychologia, examining brain responses to music-evoked nostalgia. He found that the substantia nigra, a midbrain structure adjacent to the VTA, also dopaminergic, involved in learning and in the flagging of salient events, showed altered activity in response to nostalgic music specifically. Not simply pleasant music, not simply familiar music, music that carried personal emotional history. The distinction mattered. The brain was not responding to agreeableness. It was responding to learned significance. This is why nostalgia cannot be manufactured from the outside. You cannot make someone nostalgic by simply presenting them with something pleasant. The circuitry requires prior learning. It requires that a specific cue has been paired with a specific emotional experience enough times that the association has become structural. that the dopamine system has had years, genuinely years, to calibrate its prediction to this particular input. Nostalgia is not a mood you can produce on demand. It is the output of a very long education. The adolescent brain is worth pausing on here, briefly, because it changes the math considerably. Between roughly the ages of 12 and 22, the dopaminergic response to music is heightened beyond what it will be at any other point in adult life. The mesolimbic system is more reactive during this window. The reward circuitry is more sensitive. The emotional intensity of experience is, in part, a product of the fact that dopamine is doing more work during this period than it will do later, which means that music heard during adolescence is encoded with a heavier emotional signature than music heard at 30 or 40 or 50. The dopamine response at the moment of first hearing was simply stronger. The association formed with more force, and when that music is heard again years or decades later, the cue that triggers the anticipatory dopamine response is one that was originally laid down during the brain's most chemically amplified period. The song from when you were 17 carries more weight than the song from last year, not because the song is better, because the brain that heard it was running hotter. What this means for the feeling of nostalgia, for the particular quality of its pull, is that you are not simply remembering an experience when a familiar song plays. You're re-encountering a cue that the brain learned during a period of heightened neurochemical sensitivity, and the dopamine system is firing a response calibrated to that original intensity. The response is not proportionate to the present moment. It's proportionate to who you were then, which is one reason why nostalgia can feel larger than the memory seems to warrant, why a 30-second fragment of a song can produce something that feels almost physical. The brain isn't responding to the song as it exists now, in this room, on this night. It's running a prediction based on everything it learned the first 100 times it heard those notes, in a nervous system that was considerably more reactive than the one you're living in now. The song arrives in the present. The dopamine is calibrated to the past. There is a quieter version of this that happens without music, without any obvious trigger at all. The brain's default mode network, active during rest and mind wandering, runs its own low-level retrieval, pulling at associations, testing predictions, surfacing emotional memories without being asked. And the same dopaminergic logic applies. When the network surfaces a cue, a face, a fragment of a scene, an emotional tone that has been associated through years of repetition with something the reward system has learned to value, the anticipatory signal fires. You feel something, warm, slightly aching, present tense but clearly pointed at the past. By the time you've identified what you're feeling, the prediction has already been made and the dopamine has already moved. The chemistry precedes the awareness. That sequence, the body knowing before the mind catches up, runs through most of what nostalgia does, it turns out. And nowhere is it more visible than in what happens to the feeling itself between when it arrives and when the brain decides whether it was a good prediction or a violated one, whether the memory, when it fully surfaces, matches what the dopamine expected, whether what was kept is still what was loved. Imagine holding something in both hands, something real, with weight, a smooth stone, a closed box, it doesn't matter. The weight is there. The warmth from your palms transfers to it slowly, and you are aware, in the way you're only aware of things you aren't usually thinking about, that you are holding it, that it is present. Now imagine the same weight, the same warmth, but your hands are empty. That's the closest I can get to describing what the brain does during nostalgia, and I want to be clear that it's an imperfect description, which is why I'll let it go shortly. It's not quite accurate to say you feel the memory like an object in your hands, but there's something in the sensation, the presence of something, the warmth of something, the simultaneous awareness that the hands are empty, that maps onto what the circuitry is actually doing, roughly enough to be worth mentioning once. Just once. Two things happen at the same time inside a nostalgic experience, and it's worth being precise about what they are, because the precision matters for understanding why the feeling lands the way it does. The first, the hippocampus retrieves an autobiographical memory. It pulls forward the reconstructed emotional and sensory components of a past experience, the warmth, the faces, the ambient quality of a specific time. The reward circuitry responds. Dopamine moves. The body registers something that functions chemically, like contact with something good. The second, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain most associated with executive function, temporal reasoning, the modeling of past and future, registers that the experience being retrieved is located in the past, irrecoverably, not distant, not inaccessible under current conditions, gone. The brain's capacity for temporal awareness, its ability to locate events on a timeline and understand their relationship to the present, produces a signal that is functionally the opposite of the reward signal. Not pain exactly, but the recognition of an unclosable gap. These two signals coexist. They do not take turns. They do not resolve into one another. They occupy the same moment, in the same nervous system, producing what we describe, when we reach for a word, as bittersweet. The prefrontal cortex is worth pausing on here, because it is doing something that no other region involved in nostalgia quite does. The hippocampus retrieves. The amygdala responds emotionally. The VTA releases dopamine. But the prefrontal cortex, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in self-referential processing and temporal reasoning, understands that what is being retrieved is not present. It knows. And this knowing is not a failure of the system. It's not a cognitive error or a processing glitch. It's the brain's temporal awareness doing exactly what temporal awareness does. Locating experience in time, orienting the self within a timeline, recognizing the difference between what is and what was. The problem, if it is a problem, is that this recognition arrives in the same moment as the reward signal. The warmth and the knowing land together. You cannot have one without immediately encountering the other. There is a concept in systems neuroscience called a prediction error. When the brain generates a prediction, when the dopamine system fires in anticipation of something, and the anticipated thing arrives, the error is zero. The prediction was correct, the system stabilizes. But when the anticipated thing does not arrive, when the expectation is violated, the dopamine neurons drop below baseline. A negative signal, a marking of the discrepancy between what was expected and what occurred. Nostalgia may produce a version of this that operates not across seconds but across years. The brain learned, through thousands of experiences, to associate a specific person, place, or time with a specific emotional reward. The cue arrives, a smell, a song, the start of a retrieved memory, and the anticipatory signal fires. The prediction is made. This thing is good, this thing has value, this thing should produce the feeling it has always produced. And then the retrieval completes, and the prefrontal cortex supplies its temporal annotation. This is the past. You cannot return to it. The prediction is technically correct, and the memory does carry the value that was learned, but the loop cannot close in the way loops usually close. The reward cannot be consummated in present time. The gap between the prediction and its unclosable resolution may be part of what produces the ache. Not grief, not longing in the literary sense, something more mechanical than that, a circuit that has fired and has nowhere to complete itself. Constantine Sedikides has written about this, about nostalgia's inherent sadness not residing in the memory itself, but in the awareness of its temporal distance. The memory, he argues, is predominantly positive. The tinge of sadness is not a property of the remembered experience. It is a property of the relationship between the remembering and the present moment, between what the brain is holding and what the hands cannot actually touch. This distinction matters more than it might seem, because it means the sadness in nostalgia is not evidence that the past was sad. It's evidence that the past was real, that it carried genuine value, that the brain learned something true about what mattered, and has kept that learning intact, and is now presenting it to a present moment from which those things are absent. The ache is proportional to the worth. I think so about this when nostalgia arrives for something I'd struggle to fully articulate. Not a dramatic memory, not a significant occasion, just an ordinary afternoon somewhere that no longer exists in the same form. A quality of light, a particular kind of afternoon tiredness. Something that felt at the time like nothing in particular. The brain apparently decided otherwise. It tagged it, stored it, kept it warm. And when it surfaces now, the prefrontal cortex does its work, locates it in time, marks it as gone, and the combination produces something that feels larger than the memory seems to warrant. Because the brain's assessment of its value is not based on how significant it seemed at the time, it's based on something deeper, something the amygdala recorded and the reward circuitry reinforced over years of occasional retrieval. The ordinary afternoons are often the ones that ache the most, not the weddings and the milestones, the quiet ones, the ones nobody photographed because nobody thought to. The body responds to this, to the irreversibility, to the unclosed loop, in ways that are visible if you pay attention. The muscles around the sternum, the particular heaviness behind the eyes, a quality of breathing that changes slightly without drama towards something slower and more deliberate. These are not symptoms of distress in the clinical sense. They are the body registering a signal that requires processing, that cannot be acted upon in the usual way, cannot be resolved by doing something or going somewhere, but must simply be held in the way you hold something you cannot put down and cannot carry forward, just held. There is something the research keeps returning to that I want to mention plainly, without building up to it dramatically. In study after study examining what nostalgia does to people over time, not in a single moment, but across days and weeks of naturally occurring experience, one finding appears with enough consistency to be worth stating directly. People who experience more nostalgia do not report more sadness. They report more meaning. The two feelings, the warmth and the ache, seem to do something together that neither does alone. The bittersweet combination appears to be more effective than simple happiness at producing a sense that life contains significance, that what has happened matters, that the self exists within a story that has weight. Whether this is the brain's intention, whether nostalgia was shaped by something that found this combination useful, is a question the data can suggest but not answer. What it can say is that the irreversibility, the awareness of the unclosable gap, does not appear to be a flaw in the experience. It may be the mechanism. The ache is not a side effect of the warmth. The ache is why the warmth means something. This understanding changes slightly what it means to sit with a nostalgic feeling rather than push it away or chase it. The prefrontal cortex will keep doing what it does, locating, marking, noting the gap. The reward system will keep firing. The two signals will keep arriving together, weighted against each other, neither cancelling the other out. And somewhere in the body, in the slow breath, in the particular quality of stillness that follows a wave of memory, there is something that is not quite resolution, and not quite acceptance, and not quite peace, but is close enough to all three that the difference at this hour, with the room quiet and the breath settling, may not matter. The memory was real, the warmth was real, the ache is real, all three simultaneously, in the same body, in the same moment. That is not a malfunction, that is what it means to have loved something. What hasn't been addressed yet, and what the biology makes surprisingly specific, is the question of age, of why certain years of a life produce the memories that nostalgia reaches for most reliably. Why the brain doesn't distribute its nostalgic weight evenly across a lifetime, but tends to concentrate it somewhere specific, in a window, a band of years that most people across cultures and continents seem to return to again and again. The answer has something to do with what the brain was doing during those years, and with a particular chemical intensity that has never quite been replicated since. I want to say something personal before the biology because I think it belongs here. I have a hard time with nostalgia, not always. Not in a way that stops me functioning or ruins an evening, nothing that dramatic. But there is something about the feeling, the specific quality of it, that I haven't made peace with. Not fully. The warmth arrives and I let it in, and then a few seconds later the other thing arrives too. The ache. The reaching quality. And I don't always handle that part gracefully. Sometimes I try to hold the memory longer than it wants to stay, and it starts to slip, and I try harder, and then it's gone, and I'm just left with the feeling without the content. That's the worst version of it, I think. The ache without the memory, the gap without anything filling it. I don't know if that resonates. I'm curious, genuinely. If you feel comfortable, leave something in the comments. How do you sit with it? Do you chase it or let it pass? Does it arrive at particular times of day or year? I find myself thinking about this more than I probably should, and I'm honestly not sure I've found a good answer yet. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe the not knowing is part of it. Here's what the biology offers, at least. There is a window, not a metaphorical one, a documented, measurable, neurochemically specific window of time in a person's life during which the brain encodes experience with unusual intensity. Roughly 12 to 22 years old, though the edges are soft and vary between individuals. During this period, the mesolimbic dopamine system, the same pathway we've been following through this whole chapter sequence, is running at a sensitivity it will not sustain into later adulthood. The reward circuitry is more reactive. Emotional experiences during this window are tagged with a stronger signal. The amygdala's encoding is more forceful. The hippocampus retains more. And crucially, the dopamine response to music, to all the sensory and cultural inputs that define a particular period of a person's life, is simply greater than it will be at any later point. This is not speculation. It's been measured, documented, replicated. The implications are uncomfortable if you think about them too long. The experiences that will most reliably become nostalgic, the ones the brain will reach for 20, 30, 40 years later, are largely determined during a period when you had no idea that's what was happening. You were just living, going to school, listening to music because you liked it, spending time with people because they were there, and the brain, without asking permission, was encoding all of it with a chemical intensity it would never quite replicate again. You didn't choose which memories would ache later. The nervous system chose for you. The phenomenon has a name in memory research, the reminiscence bump. It refers to the finding, consistent across cultures, across age groups, across decades of autobiographical memory research, that adults disproportionately recall events from roughly the first 2 decades of life when asked to retrieve their most significant memories, not evenly distributed across a lifetime, concentrated, weighted toward those years. Several explanations exist, and they are probably all partially true. Novelty matters. First experiences are encoded more deeply because the brain hasn't yet built a schema for them. Identity formation matters. Adolescence and early adulthood are when the sense of self is actively being constructed, and the memories that contributed to that construction are tagged accordingly. But the dopaminergic component, the simple fact that the reward circuitry was more sensitive during that window, appears to be a significant contributor. The music that moves you most reliably is usually music you first heard between 12 and 22, not because it's better music, because the brain that heard it was running on a different chemistry than the one you're using now. What I find strange about this, and strange and a little tender, if I'm honest, is that most people don't know this is happening while it's happening. Nobody tells you at 15 that the song playing in the background right now is being encoded with unusual force, that the specific quality of this afternoon, this friendship, this particular combination of boredom and aliveness that only seems to exist when you're young enough to still find everything simultaneously dull and overwhelming. Nobody tells you it's being filed away with extra care. You find out later, when it comes back, when a chord plays and something in the chest responds with more force than the song seems to warrant, and you understand, or begin to understand, that you're not responding to the song as it exists now. You're responding to who you were when it became part of you. The prefrontal cortex, which we talked about in the last chapter, the region that registers time and irreversibility, is also still developing during this window. It doesn't reach full functional maturity until the mid-20s, which means that during the period when emotional encoding is at its most intense, the system most responsible for moderating and contextualizing emotional response is still being built. Adolescent experience is encoded more intensely, partly because the brake isn't fully installed yet. The emotional signal hits the amygdala, and the reward circuitry at full force, with less prefrontal modulation than would exist in an adult brain. The encoding is stronger because the filtering is weaker, and years later, when that memory is retrieved, it arrives carrying all the intensity of its original recording, produced in a nervous system with fewer emotional guardrails than the one doing the remembering now. This is why nostalgia for adolescence can feel almost too large, disproportionate to the actual events. A Tuesday afternoon from 2003 should not produce this much feeling, but it was encoded in a brain that experienced Tuesday afternoons differently than you experience Tuesdays now. There's something in there that I sit with on bad nostalgia days, the ones where the feeling arrives heavy and I don't manage it particularly well. The thought that the intensity isn't a measure of how good things were then or how bad things are now. It's a measure of what the brain was doing chemically during a specific developmental window. That doesn't make the feeling smaller. It doesn't resolve anything. But it does make it feel slightly less like a verdict. The other thing worth saying, and this connects back to the reminiscence bump, and to what the brain seems to be optimizing for during that adolescent window, is that the memories encoded most intensely during those years are overwhelmingly social ones. Not achievements, not events in isolation. People, friendships, the specific feeling of being known by someone your age, of belonging to a group of people navigating something together, of the ridiculous and serious texture of relationships formed when both people were still figuring out who they were. The reward circuitry, even in adolescence, is fundamentally oriented towards social experience, which is why when nostalgia reaches into that window, it almost always pulls back people. The same pattern we found in every other chapter. The brain reaching toward connection, toward the specific warmth of having been known. What hasn't been explored yet, what sits underneath this structurally, is what the brain is doing during all the time between those early encodings and the moment the memory resurfaces. What happens to a stored experience during the hours and years when it is not being retrieved? Whether it sits unchanged, waiting, or whether something else is happening in the tissue. Whether the brain tends it, whether rest, this particular kind of rest, in the dark, in the quiet, is part of that tending. The room is probably quiet now, not silent. There's almost never true silence, even late. The hum of something electrical, the distant sound of a street that hasn't entirely stopped, maybe the particular non-sound of a house settling, doing whatever houses do when the people inside them go still. These things are there, they're just not demanding anything. And your brain, which has been processing incoming information since before you woke up this morning, sorting, responding, filtering, planning, comparing, is beginning to do something different. Not nothing, never nothing. There is a network of brain regions that neuroscientists spent a long time not fully understanding, because it activates when subjects are told to rest. When someone in an fMRI scanner is given no task, when they're asked to simply lie still and let the mind go where it goes, a particular set of regions lights up. The medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, the hippocampus, regions distributed across the brain but connected, coordinated, running together as a functional unit. This network was initially called the task-negative network, because it seemed to switch off during focused tasks and switch on in their absence. A kind of neural idle mode, the default when nothing else was demanded. The name that stuck is simpler, the default mode network, and it is not idling. What the default mode network does during rest is something researchers have been mapping for roughly 2 decades now, and the picture that has emerged is considerably more interesting than the name suggests. It is involved in self-referential processing, thinking about yourself, your history, your relationships, your place in ongoing time. It runs mental simulations, imagining future scenarios, replaying past ones, modeling what other people might be thinking or feeling. It retrieves autobiographical memory, not deliberately, not with specific search parameters, but in a kind of slow browsing, pulling things up, turning them over, setting them down. Mind wandering is not the brain going offline, it's the brain switching to a different kind of work. And the content of that work, what the default mode network actually retrieves and processes during rest, is heavily weighted toward what matters emotionally, toward people, toward events that carry personal significance, toward the memories the amygdala flagged years ago as worth keeping carefully. This is, I think, one of the reasons nostalgia tends to arrive in still moments. Not because stillness makes you weak or susceptible or sentimental, but because stillness gives the default mode network room to do what it's built to do. The focused tasks that occupy the day keep other networks dominant: the salience network, the central executive network, the attentional systems that manage incoming information. When those quiet down, the default mode network comes forward. It has been waiting. The hippocampus is deeply embedded in this network, more than most anatomy diagrams suggest. The hippocampus participates in default mode activity during rest, contributing to the autobiographical browsing supplying the memory architecture that the network draws on during mind wandering. And during this participation, something else happens that goes well beyond simple retrieval. Memory consolidation, the process by which experiences move from unstable, recently encoded traces into more durable long-term storage, depends heavily on rest, sleep especially, but also the quieter waking rest that precedes sleep, the lying still, the mind beginning to untether from the day's demands. During these periods, the hippocampus replays recent experience, not consciously, not as a felt sensation of remembering, but in a neural sense. The patterns of activation that occurred during the day's events are rerun, in compressed and accelerated form, and the connections that support those memories are strengthened. The brain rehearses what it wants to keep. What this means for the memories that nostalgia eventually retrieves years or decades later is that they did not simply sit unchanged between their formation and their surfacing. They were returned to, replayed, strengthened during hundreds of nights of consolidation across the years between the experience and the remembering. Each retrieval, each night of quiet replay, each moment the default mode network turned its slow attention toward a stored experience and held it briefly. All of this contributed to what the memory is now. It's not quite accurate to say a memory is preserved. It's more accurate to say it's continuously maintained. The brain tends its archive the way you might tend something you care about not losing, not dramatically, quietly, during the off hours, without making a point of it. There is a particular quality of thought that arrives in the period just before sleep, not sleep itself, but the approach to it. Hypnagogia, technically, the threshold state. The brain moving out of full wakefulness, the default mode network becoming increasingly dominant, external input fading, internal processing rising. Thoughts in this state have a specific texture, looser, less governed by the logical sequencing that waking cognition requires. Images arrive without being called. Associations form that would not form during the day. Memories surface in combinations that seem, from a waking perspective, slightly random, but which may reflect the default mode network's own organizational logic, which is emotional and associative rather than linear. Nostalgia, when it arrives at this threshold, has a different quality than it does during the day. More diffuse, less specific. The warmth is there, the reaching quality is there, but the edges are softer. The prefrontal cortex, the structure that timestamps and contextualizes memory, that supplies the awareness of irreversibility, is beginning to step back. The inhibitory control that keeps daytime thinking organized is loosening. What remains is closer to pure feeling than to memory with content. Warm, directionless, present. The default mode network is also where the brain processes the self across time, not just who you are now, in this room, in this body, but the sense of continuity. The feeling that the person who went to school decades ago and the person lying in the dark right now are the same person. That there is a thread, that the experiences you remember are yours in a way that means something. The posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, both nodes in the default mode network, are centrally involved in this sense of personal continuity, in the maintenance of the self as story. Nostalgia, operating through these same regions, may be partly how the brain keeps that story coherent, how it periodically retrieves and reinforces the emotional landmarks that define who you are and have been. Not as deliberate self-reflection, that's a daytime activity, effortful and conscious, more as background maintenance, the network running its quiet checks, verifying that the archive is intact, that the people are still there, that the warmth is preserved, that you are still continuous with yourself. This is happening in you right now in some form, not the nostalgia necessarily, though it may be in the loose pre-sleep way. But the default mode network is active. The hippocampus is doing its nighttime work. Somewhere in the tissue of your brain, the experiences of this day are being sorted, the emotional ones weighted, the ones deemed significant quietly reinforced. And somewhere deeper in the archive, older memories are being touched, briefly without your awareness, as the brain runs its maintenance. Your grandfather is in there, if you have one like mine, stored, maintained. The neural pattern of his face and his laugh held in tissue that has been keeping it for years, replaying it at intervals, making sure it doesn't fade below retrieval threshold. The people you miss are being tended, not because the brain is sentimental, because it is thorough, because it learned that those patterns carry value, and it does not discard what carries value without reason. The network will keep running as you fall asleep. The content will shift. The default mode network's activity continues into certain sleep stages, transformed into something less narratively coherent, looser, more associative. Whether what happens in sleep to autobiographical memory is a continuation of what the default mode network does during waking rest, or something categorically different, is still being worked out. The honest answer is that the border between consolidation and dreaming is not as clean as neuroscience once assumed. Memory, rest, dream, they share more circuitry than they share credit for. The brain behind your closed eyes isn't waiting for morning. It's already somewhere, doing what it does, moving through the archive slowly, handling things carefully, running the quiet processes that make remembering possible at all. You don't have to do anything. It knows what it's keeping. I'm sitting outside as I write this. A bench. Old wood. The kind that has absorbed enough seasons to feel slightly soft at the surface. It's the bench where my best friend from school and I used to sit, after class mostly, sometimes during if we had found a good enough reason to be somewhere else. We'd sit here and talk about things that felt, at the time, enormously important. And some of them probably were, and some of them were just the ordinary conversation of two people who were comfortable enough with each other that silence was also fine. We hardly see each other now, not because anything happened. Nothing happened. Life got busy in the particular way life gets busy, gradually then completely, without any single moment you could point to and say, there, that's when it changed. Different cities for a while, different schedules, the months between messages getting longer without either of us deciding they should. It's one of those distances that accumulates without drama, and I think that kind of distance is its own specific hard thing, different from fear of falling out, different from a loss, quieter than both, and in some ways more confusing because there's nothing to resolve. Sitting here now on this bench, I can feel the memories pressing in. Not gently, they're just there, specific and textured. His laugh. A particular argument we had once that neither of us remembers the content of now, only that we had it and got through it, and it didn't matter. The way afternoons felt when you were 17 and had nowhere in particular to be, and that felt like freedom rather than emptiness. I wonder if he thinks about this bench. Here is what the hippocampus is doing right now, while I sit here. Physical locations are one of the most powerful memory triggers the brain has. Not because of something poetic about place, because of something structural. The hippocampus encodes memory in context. Every experience is stored not just as content, what happened, who was there, what it felt like, but as a spatial and temporal index. The context of the experience is embedded in the memory trace itself, which means that returning to the physical location of a memory is not simply encountering a reminder. It is partially re-entering the encoding context. The hippocampus recognizes the place. and recognition of context initiates retrieval. This is sometimes called context-dependent memory, and it operates below conscious control. You don't decide to remember when you return somewhere. The environment does something to the retrieval system before you've had a chance to decide anything. The spatial cues, the angle of light, the particular hardness of a surface, the ambient sounds that match a stored context, begin reinstating the neural pattern associated with this place. The memory activates because the context that encoded it is present again. Which is why sitting on this bench doesn't feel like choosing to remember. It feels like being remembered by the place. The social architecture of nostalgia is something the research has been consistent about. In study after study examining the content of nostalgic memories, what people actually remember when they remember nostalgically, one feature appears so reliably it has become almost definitional. Other people, not events, not achievements, not places in isolation. People, specifically, people with whom the remembering self shared something. Belonging, recognition. The particular ease of a relationship where you didn't have to explain yourself because the other person already knew. Researchers including Constantine Sedikides and Krystine Batcho have both noted that the social component of nostalgia is not incidental, it's structural. The brain encodes shared experience differently than solitary experience. The amygdala's response to emotionally significant social events is stronger. The reward signal associated with genuine connection is more durable. The memories that nostalgia retrieves are overwhelmingly memories of not being alone. The brain is, at its most fundamental level, a social organ. Not in a loose or figurative sense. Structurally, the neural architecture that manages facial recognition, voice processing, emotional attunement, the modeling of other minds, these systems are not peripheral additions to a brain that could have functioned without them. They are central, enormous in their metabolic cost, disproportionate in the space they occupy relative to other systems. The brain invests heavily in other people. It always has, because for most of human evolutionary history, being embedded in a social group was the difference between surviving and not, and so the brain learns people the way it learns nothing else. It builds detailed, durable neural representations of the individuals who matter, their faces, their voices, their emotional signatures, the particular feeling of being in their presence. It encodes their physical warmth, their laugh, their conversational rhythms. It stores not just who they are, but what it felt like to be near them, what version of yourself you were when you were with them. This last part is the one that catches me. The version of yourself that appears in a nostalgic memory is not incidental to the memory. It is part of what the memory is. The hippocampus doesn't store just the external scene, who was there, what was said. It stores the self that was present. The emotional state of the remembering self at the time, the specific way you inhabited your own body during that period. When you remember this bench, when I remember this bench, what returns is not just a friend. What returns is also a version of me that sat here without knowing what the next decade would look like. Who had a specific quality of aliveness that felt ordinary then, and feels, in retrospect, like something particular. Something I didn't know to pay attention to because I didn't know it was finite. The self in the memory is younger, less certain, more present maybe, in the way you can be present when fewer things are pulling at you. That version of yourself is not gone. Not entirely. The neural continuity the default mode network maintains means something here, but it is also not quite available in the same form. The person who sat here at 17 was using a brain that was running on the dopaminergic intensity we talked about in the last chapter. A brain without the years of prefrontal development that have since accumulated. A brain that experienced this bench as unremarkable and important at the same time, without needing to choose between those two things. That self is in the memory. And part of what the ache is, I think, part of the reaching quality that nostalgia produces, is not just missing the person across from you. It is missing the version of yourself that only existed in their company. That was partly constituted by that specific relationship, that specific time, that specific way of two people being easy together. What happens neurologically when a close friendship loosens, gradually without drama, is not well studied in the way that grief after loss is studied. But what we know about social bond formation is relevant here. The brain builds the neural representation of a close friend over time through repeated interaction. Each encounter reinforces the pattern. The reward circuitry associates their presence with something good. The predictive systems build detailed models of their behavior and voice and face. The brain invests, and when the interactions become less frequent, when the reinforcement slows, the pattern doesn't dissolve. It persists. The investment remains. The neural representation of this person is still there, still detailed, still capable of activating the reward signal and the emotional associations built over years of friendship. But the real-time input that used to confirm and update the representation has thinned. The pattern remains. The person is less available to it. That gap between the stored neural pattern of someone and their current presence in your life might be part of what produces the specific quality of nostalgia for a friendship that hasn't ended, but has changed. It isn't grief. The person is still in the world, but the version of the relationship that the brain encoded so carefully, that version exists now only in retrieval, only in memory, only here, on this bench, on an afternoon that is and is not the same as the afternoons it used to be. I don't have a tidy way to end this. I sat here for a while after I finished the last paragraph and the light changed, the way it does in the late afternoon, going slightly golden and then starting to thin, and I thought about sending him a message. I might. I probably will eventually. We always do eventually. And it's always fine when we do, easy in the way it used to be, which is something. But I also just sat here, with the bench, with the memories it kept, with the version of both of us that apparently still lives in the hippocampal index of this specific location, ready to reinstate every time the spatial context is re-entered. The brain keeps people. It keeps the versions of yourself that existed alongside them. It keeps the specific feeling of belonging to a time and a place and a friendship, and it will keep retrieving these things in the evenings, in the cold, in the still moments before sleep, and on benches like this one. Not because the past was better, not because the present is insufficient, but because the brain learned something true about what mattered, and it does not, without very good reason, let true things go. What happens when all of this, the retrieval, the reward signal, the social ache, the irreversibility, begins to do something beyond just producing a feeling? When the feeling has a function, not just a texture but a purpose, what the brain might actually be trying to accomplish when it reaches backward, and why that reaching might be worth something beyond the moment it produces. That's where this goes next. Every cell in the lining of your stomach is replaced within a few days. The cells of your skin turn over in weeks. Bone tissue remodels itself over years. The skeleton you have now shares almost no material with the one you had a decade ago. Red blood cells last roughly 4 months. Even neurons, long thought to be permanent, are now known to undergo changes at their synaptic connection so continuously that the brain you are using to process this sentence is, in a measurable physical sense, different from the brain that woke up this morning. The body does not hold still, and yet there is something that persists through all of this material turnover, something that feels, and I want to use that word carefully because it matters, continuous. The person who sat on that school bench as a teenager and the person lying in the dark tonight are made of almost entirely different matter, different cells, different proteins, synaptic weights shifted by decades of accumulated experience, and still there is the sense of a thread, of being the same self that lived those earlier years, not just remembering someone who did. How does that work? The neuroscience of personal identity is not a settled field. I want to say that clearly, because what follows is genuine scientific territory, but not finished territory. What we have are components, well-studied, well-documented components, and a reasonable understanding of how they might fit together. Complete answer. The medial prefrontal cortex is involved. So is the posterior cingulate cortex. Both are nodes in the default mode network, the network we followed through the last chapter, the one that becomes dominant during rest, during mind wandering, during the approach to sleep. These regions are active when you think about yourself. when you evaluate your own traits, your own history, your own continuity across time. They're involved in what researchers call self-referential processing, the brain modeling itself as an object in time, and they are deeply connected to the hippocampus. The same structure that retrieves autobiographical memory is tightly coupled to the regions that process self-referential information, which means that memory retrieval and self-concept are not separate operations running on parallel tracks. They're integrated. The self that the brain constructs and maintains is, in part, built from retrieved autobiographical memory. You know who you are partly because of what you remember having experienced. Nostalgia sits inside this architecture in a specific way. When a nostalgic memory is retrieved, not any autobiographical memory, but specifically a nostalgic one, emotionally significant, socially embedded, charged with the particular warmth that the hippocampal VTA loop produces, it does something to self-concept that neutral memory retrieval does not. Research by Constantine Sedikides and colleagues found that nostalgic recall reliably increases what they call self-continuity, the felt sense of being connected to one's past self, the sense that the person you were is genuinely related to the person you are, that the thread is real. This sounds simple. It isn't. The brain's sense of self-continuity is not automatically maintained. It requires upkeep. It can be disrupted by major life transitions, by significant losses, by the kind of change that comes so fast or cuts so deep that the connection between the earlier self and the present one becomes difficult to feel. People who have experienced severe trauma sometimes describe a fracture in this continuity, a before and after so distinct that the two selves seem barely related. People moving through large life transitions, immigration, bereavement, the end of a long relationship, often report something similar, a loosening of the thread. This is not merely psychological, it has neural correlates. The self-referential processing regions, working with the hippocampus, are doing something active when continuity is maintained, and something less efficient, less integrated, when it's disrupted. Nostalgia appears to be one of the mechanisms by which continuity is restored when it loosens. When experimental participants are induced to feel nostalgic, shown photographs from their past, asked to recall a personally significant memory, exposed to music associated with earlier periods of their life, their reported sense of self-continuity increases. The medial prefrontal cortex, engaging with the retrieved memory, seems to use the emotional content of the nostalgic experience to reinforce the connection between the past self and the present one. To confirm in some neural sense that the thread is intact, the brain is not passively experiencing the memory, it is using it. There's something about the specificity of nostalgic memory that matters here, something that distinguishes it from general reminiscence. Nostalgic memories are overwhelmingly memories where you were yourself, not performing, not managing, not being who the situation required. Memories where you were recognizably, uncomplicatedly you, with people who knew that version of you in context that allowed it. The bench, the table at a family meal, an afternoon with a grandparent who found you funny without you trying to be. These memories carry a particular kind of identity information. They are evidence, held in tissue, retrievable on demand, that the self has existed, that it has been known by others, that it has had weight and texture and continuity long before the present moment. When the brain retrieves them and the reward circuitry responds, the self-referential regions receive something that functions like confirmation. This is who you have been, and who you have been is real. This confirmation matters more at certain times than others. Times of transition, times of uncertainty, times when the present moment feels unstable or thin or hard to locate yourself within. The research on nostalgia as a buffer against existential threat, work by Routledge and colleagues across more than a decade of study, consistently finds that people reach for nostalgic memory more frequently when their sense of meaning or identity feels under pressure. Not consciously, not as a deliberate strategy. The brain reaches automatically. The default mode network, detecting the deficit, produces a retrieval. The past arrives not as escape, but as anchor. There's a difference. Escape would mean the memory is used to avoid the present. Anchor means the memory is used to stabilize the self enough to remain in the present, to continue functioning, to maintain coherence, to keep the thread visible when the current moment is making it hard to see. The distinction is small, but it matters. Dopamine is involved here too. Re-encoding matters more than is sometimes recognized. Each time a nostalgic memory is retrieved, the hippocampal VTA loop does not simply play it back unchanged. The retrieval is also a re-encoding event. The memory that is returned to storage after retrieval has been updated, slightly subtly, by the context and emotional state of the current retrieval. And the dopamine released during the nostalgic retrieval reinforces the association between that memory and its reward value, makes it slightly more retrievable, slightly more warm. This means that nostalgic memory, across repeated retrievals over years, becomes progressively more integrated into the self-concept, more available, more central to what the brain reaches for when it needs to locate itself in time. The memories that nostalgia uses are not just retrieved, they are maintained, reinforced, kept warm by the act of returning to them. The brain does not accidentally keep certain memories more accessible than others. It keeps the ones that do the most useful work. There is something I find quietly astonishing about this, and I don't want to overdress it, so I'll just say it plainly. The fact that you can lie in the dark and feel, however faintly, that you are the same person who stood in a school corridor at 15, that the self is continuous across all that time and all that physical change, that feeling is not given, it is produced by neural circuitry, by the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate and the hippocampus running their integrative processes, by the default mode network doing its quiet maintenance during exactly these kinds of still moments. And nostalgia is part of the mechanism, not the whole of it, but a real part. The emotionally significant memories, retrieved with warmth, processed through self-referential networks, re-encoded with their reward value intact, these are some of the threads the brain uses to keep the self coherent across time, to keep you recognizable to yourself, which makes the ache make a different kind of sense. If nostalgia is partly a continuity mechanism, if the brain is using the retrieved memory to confirm the thread between past and present self, then the sadness in it is not a malfunction of the process. It is a feature. The past self and the present self are being held in the same moment of awareness. The distance between them is real. The years between the bench at 15 and the room at whatever age you are tonight are real years, containing real change. The ache is the brain registering its own continuity, feeling the distance that confirms the thread is long, that time has passed, that the self being maintained across that time is genuine, that something has persisted through all the cellular turnover and synaptic shifting and accumulated experience. Something is still here, the same something that sat somewhere specific years ago with people who knew it, still here. What happens when this mechanism, this continuity maintenance, this identity anchoring, is pushed into territory it wasn't quite built for? When the nostalgic feeling doesn't soften the present but sharpens it? When the reaching quality becomes something heavier? When the brain that was built to use the past as a resource begins, in some people under some conditions, to lean on it too hard? Not often, not for most people most of the time, but worth understanding. Start with what's true most of the time. For most people across most days, nostalgia does what the previous chapters have described. It arrives, it produces its bittersweet signal, it performs its quiet functions, continuity maintenance, loneliness buffering, meaning reinforcement, and then it passes. The wave moves through, the warmth stays slightly longer than the ache. The present moment reasserts itself. Life continues. This is the common experience, documented, replicated. The research on nostalgia's benefits is substantial and genuine and not overstated. But the research also contains something else, something that gets less airtime because it's less comfortable, and because the field spent so long rehabilitating nostalgia from its pathological origins that discussing its shadow felt for a while like backsliding, like returning nostalgia to the 17th century physician's office where Hofer first filed it as a disease, It isn't that. It's something more specific and more nuanced than that. The same mechanism that makes nostalgia useful under most conditions can, under particular conditions, produce something quite different. The key variable is not the nostalgia itself, it's the emotional context it lands in. A 2022 study published in the journal Emotion, the one that introduced what the researchers called the Bittersweet Variation Model of nostalgia, found something that had been underexplored in the previous decades of nostalgia research. Experimental studies of nostalgia, which dominate the literature, tend to ask participants to deliberately recall their most positive nostalgic memories under controlled conditions. The outcomes are reliably good. Mood improves, meaning increases, loneliness decreases. But in daily life, nostalgia doesn't always arrive under controlled conditions. It arrives in whatever emotional weather the day has produced. And when researchers tracked naturally occurring nostalgia across daily diary studies, real people, real days, uncontrolled emotional contexts, the picture became more variable. On days already coloured by negative emotion, nostalgia did not reliably improve things. Sometimes it amplified what was already difficult. The bitter outweighed the sweet. The wave moved through and left more sediment than it cleared. The anterior cingulate cortex is part of this story. It sits at the intersection of cognitive and emotional processing, involved in error detection, conflict monitoring, the regulation of emotional response. When nostalgia arrives, the anterior cingulate is active. It is doing something, modulating the interaction between the retrieved memory and the current emotional state, managing the relationship between the warmth of the past and the conditions of the present. Under ordinary conditions, this regulation is efficient. The anterior cingulate moderates the contrast between remembered warmth and present reality. The gap is registered but not overwhelming. The circuit does its work and the feeling passes through at a manageable intensity. Under conditions of already elevated negative affect, when the baseline emotional state is one of significant sadness or anxiety, or a pervasive sense of meaninglessness, the regulation is more costly. The brain is already working harder to manage its emotional state. The anterior cingulate is already under load. And when nostalgia arrives on top of that, when the hippocampus retrieves something warm and the prefrontal cortex immediately notes the distance between that warmth and the current moment, the gap can feel less like a gentle ache and more like exposure. The contrast sharpens. The warmth of the memory makes the present feel worse by comparison, not better. This is the mechanism, not a character flaw, not a weakness in the person experiencing it. A biological state where the same circuitry that usually buffers against difficulty is instead amplifying it, because the conditions it's operating under have changed the math. I think it's important to say that plainly because the experience, when it happens, can feel like a personal failure, like you're doing nostalgia wrong, like other people managed to feel the warmth and let it help, and you're somehow producing the bad version of the feeling. But the bad version isn't produced by something wrong with you. It's produced by the interaction between a normal mechanism and an unusually difficult emotional context. The mechanism is the same. The context changed the outcome. There is a subset of individuals for whom this dynamic is more consistent, not occasional, habitual. Researchers have described what some call maladaptive nostalgia, a pattern in which nostalgic recall becomes decoupled from its regulatory function and instead operates as a form of rumination. The person returns repeatedly to the past, not because the retrieval is completing some useful function, continuity, meaning, loneliness buffering, but because the return has become compulsive. A loop. The default mode network, normally capable of retrieving and releasing, gets partially stuck. The retrieval generates some emotional relief, enough to reinforce the behavior, but not enough to close the loop or restore the deficit it was meant to address. So the brain reaches again and again. The past feels increasingly real relative to a present that increasingly feels inadequate. The contrast between the archived warmth and the current emotional state widens rather than narrows. This pattern has been associated with higher rates of depression and anxiety. Not as a cause necessarily, the directionality is genuinely unclear, but as a correlation robust enough to take seriously. The brain that ruminates nostalgically may be a brain that is struggling with its present in ways that memory retrieval cannot fix, however many times it tries. There is a study, I want to mention it carefully without dramatizing it, in which participants identified as chronic worriers were induced into nostalgic states and then assessed for mood and anxiety. Unlike the general population, for whom nostalgic induction reliably improved mood, this group showed a different pattern. Nostalgia induction was followed by increased anxiety symptoms, increased rumination. The same emotional lever that usually moved things towards stability moved them, in this subset, further from it. The mechanism was the same, the nervous system was different. Svetlana Boym, a cultural theorist rather than a neuroscientist, but her framework maps usefully onto the biology, described two modes of nostalgic engagement. She called one restorative nostalgia, the attempt to rebuild what has been lost, to treat the past as a blueprint for the present, to close the gap by pulling the present toward the remembered state. And she called the other reflective nostalgia, the practice of sitting with the longing and the impermanence together, without trying to resolve either, without demanding that the gap close. The first mode, she argued, is where nostalgia becomes most dangerous. Not because wanting the past back is pathological, the desire is universal and biologically grounded, but because the project of restoration is impossible. The past cannot be reinstated. The people, the selves, the specific chemistry of a particular time, these cannot be recovered. And a brain organized around a project it cannot complete generates sustained negative prediction error, sustained awareness of unmet expectation, a signal of deficiency that never resolves because the resolution being sought is structurally unavailable. The second mode, reflective, accepting, present to the longing without being consumed by it, is closer to what the healthy nostalgic brain appears to do naturally. Hold the warmth, register the distance, let both be true, and then return to the present, not defeated, but slightly more anchored than before. Easier described than practiced, I know that. There are evenings, and I'm sure you have some version of this, where the feeling arrives heavy and the anterior cingulate is doing its best and it isn't quite enough. Where the memory is warm and the present is hard and the contrast between them is not subtle. Where the ache doesn't function as an anchor, but as a pull. Where the past feels more livable than wherever you currently are. On those evenings, the biology isn't malfunctioning. It's just operating under conditions that reveal its limits. The system was not built to be the only resource. It was built to be one among several. Social connection, meaning, physical comfort, the quiet of rest. These are the other levers, the ones that change the emotional baseline that nostalgia has to work against. When the baseline is low enough, the lever moves differently. The regulation systems that manage how nostalgia lands, the anterior cingulate, the medial prefrontal cortex, the broader emotional regulation architecture, are the same systems that are most affected by sleep deprivation, chronic stress, prolonged social isolation, and sustained negative affect. Which means the conditions under which nostalgia is most likely to turn heavy are precisely the conditions under which the brain's capacity to regulate it has been most depleted. It isn't bad timing. It's the same mechanism producing the same output under different resource conditions. This is the chapter that needed to be here, not to frighten anyone, not to turn nostalgia back into a disease, but because understanding the full shape of something requires knowing where its edges are, where it can help and where, under particular conditions, it can't, where the warmth functions as warmth and where, in certain nervous systems, on certain nights, it functions as contrast. The biology is honest about this. It doesn't promise that the feeling will always be manageable. It only explains what happens when it isn't and why, and what the conditions are that shift the outcome. What it also shows, consistently across the research, is that even the heavier version of the feeling is temporary. The wave passes, the anterior cingulate recovers. The baseline, given enough of the other things the body needs, lifts. The present reasserts itself. Not quickly sometimes, but it does. There is a study that I keep returning to, Not because it's the most dramatic finding in the nostalgia literature, it isn't, but because of how specific it is. The specificity is what gets me every time. Researchers in China asked participants to recall either a nostalgic memory or an ordinary autobiographical memory, something recent and emotionally neutral. Same instruction format, same duration, same lab conditions. Then they measured pain threshold. How much physical discomfort the body could tolerate before signaling that something needed to stop. The nostalgia group held longer, not by a dramatic margin, not a finding that rewrites medicine, but measurable, statistically reliable, reproducible. People who had just spent a few minutes with a warm, personally significant memory from their past could tolerate more physical pain than people who had spent those same minutes with a neutral one. A memory, producing a change in pain threshold. I find this strange in a way that doesn't diminish with familiarity. The 2012 findings by Tim Wildschut's team at Southampton, the ones we discussed back in Chapter 4, where nostalgic recall changed how warm a cold room felt and extended the time people could hold their hand in ice water, were early signals of this. But the Chinese Academy of Sciences work went further. It wasn't just cold tolerance. 3 separate studies examining different types of physical discomfort produced the same pattern. Nostalgia buffered against the experience of pain, not by distracting from it exactly, by something more specific than distraction, by actually changing the threshold at which the body registers pain as intolerable. The periaqueductal grey. It sits in the midbrain, a region of grey matter surrounding the cerebral aqueduct, small enough that most anatomy diagrams give it only passing mention. But it is central to something the body does that is more sophisticated than it has any right to be. The endogenous modulation of pain, the brain's own system for managing nociceptive signals before they fully register as felt pain. The periaqueductal grey receives input from the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, from emotional processing regions. It projects downward to the spinal cord, where it can inhibit the transmission of pain signals before they ascend to conscious awareness. This is the pathway involved in placebo analgesia, the measurable pain relief produced by expectation and belief alone. It is also the pathway through which opioids, both endogenous and pharmacological, exert much of their effect. It responds to emotional state. When the emotional state shifts, when something activates the reward system, when positive affect increases, when the limbic system generates a signal associated with warmth or safety, the periaqueductal grey can modulate pain transmission accordingly. The signal from the periphery is the same, the nerve fibre fires, but somewhere between the skin and the conscious experience of pain, something changes. The body decides how much of the signal to pass through. Nostalgia, generating its particular combination of limbic warmth and dopaminergic reward signal, appears to influence this gate. Not dramatically, not in a way that would substitute for analgesia in any clinical sense, but the emotional signal that nostalgia produces, the warmth, the social belonging, the reward circuitry engaging with a memory the brain has learned to value, is enough to shift the activity of the systems that modulate pain, enough to move the threshold slightly, to make the intolerable slightly more tolerable. The body can use the past as a resource even against physical discomfort, which is, when you hold it plainly like that, a genuinely strange thing for a nervous system to be capable of. There is a broader literature here that provides context. Pain and social experience share neural circuitry more extensively than is commonly known. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region involved in emotional regulation during nostalgia, is also activated by physical pain, and by social pain, rejection, exclusion, the experience of loneliness. The overlap is not metaphorical. Functional imaging studies show that the experience of social exclusion activates regions of the pain matrix, the same network engaged by physical injury. The body does not draw a clean line between these things, which means the systems that generate comfort, social warmth, belonging, the felt sense of connection, are operating in the same architecture as the systems that process pain. They share the same circuitry at key nodes, and when the comfort systems activate strongly enough, they have access through the periaqueductal grey and its downstream projections to the pain transmission pathway. Warmth and pain management are neighbours in the nervous system, closer neighbours than most people realise. Endogenous opioids are likely part of this. The brain produces its own opioid-like compounds, endorphins, enkephalins, dynorphins, distributed through receptors that overlap considerably with the receptors that pharmacological opioids bind to. These endogenous compounds are released during positive social experience, during physical contact with trusted others, during states of emotional warmth. They contribute to the feeling of well-being that social connection produces, and they exert analgesic effects through the periaqueductal grey and spinal cord circuitry. Whether nostalgic recall directly triggers endogenous opioid release is not definitively established. The research hasn't cleanly isolated that mechanism yet. But the behavioural outcomes, reduced pain perception, increased tolerance, are consistent with what endogenous opioid activity would produce. The pathway exists. The stimuli that activate the pathway include positive emotional and social signals. Nostalgia generates positive emotional and social signals. The connection is reasonable, not proven to the last step, but reasonable. I want to pause on something that the research doesn't fully address, but that I find myself thinking about regardless. The participants in these studies weren't doing anything unusual. They weren't meditating. They weren't engaging in any deliberate pain management technique. They were just remembering, sitting with a memory that mattered to them, a person, a place, a time, and that act, ordinary, involuntary, universally available, produced a measurable change in what the body could bear. No equipment, no training, no intervention, just memory. The past, doing something for the present that the present couldn't do for itself. There is an evolutionary argument here that several researchers have gestured at without fully committing to, and I'll gesture at it the same way. Pain modulation would have been useful. An organism that could, under conditions of social warmth and belonging, partially suppress pain signal transmission, could keep moving when an injured organism might stop, could persist through physical difficulty that would otherwise be immobilizing, could remain functional in the presence of a social group whose presence generated the necessary limbic warmth. Whether the analgesic capacity of social warmth evolved for this purpose, or whether it's a byproduct of the shared circuitry between social experience and nociception, is not something the data can cleanly answer. But the effect, regardless of origin, is documented. Being remembered by people who cared, remembering people who cared. These are not just emotional experiences, they are physiological ones. They change what the body can do. Right now, in the dark, the body is doing something with pain that it does every night. The periaqueductal grey maintains a baseline level of descending inhibition, a constant low-level modulation of pain signals that keeps ordinary sensory input from registering as painful. During sleep, some of this changes. Pain thresholds shift with sleep stages. The body manages nociception differently at different depths of sleep. This is part of why sleep deprivation increases pain sensitivity. The modulation system that operates optimally in states of rest and safety becomes less efficient when rest is disrupted. The body in rest is, among other things, in a state of reduced pain, lower threshold for what can be ignored, higher threshold for what must be attended to, and somewhere in the tissue right now, the default mode network is running its quiet retrievals. The hippocampus is doing its consolidation. The memories being tended tonight, the warm ones, the socially rich ones, the ones the amygdala tagged with extra care, are available, not being deliberately retrieved, just present in the network, accessible, close enough that the body can almost feel them. The chest is a place where nostalgia tends to register. This has come up before and it's worth naming one more time plainly, not metaphorically. The interoceptive processing that runs through the insula, the anterior cingulate, the networks involved in the felt sense of the body's internal state, These respond to emotional memory in ways that produce actual physical sensation. A heaviness, a warmth, a quality of pressure that is not painful but is not nothing. Real sensation, produced by memory, routed through the body's own circuitry. The past has weight, literally. It produces sensations in tissue. And those sensations, strange as the research makes them sound, are the body doing something useful, processing, integrating, managing the signals that emotional experience generates, using the past, its warmth, its social richness, its deeply encoded reward value, to do something for the present that the present, in its ordinary ongoing difficulty, cannot always do for itself. The memory reaches in. The body receives it. Something somewhere in the circuitry, the periaqueductal grey, the anterior cingulate, the endogenous systems built for exactly this kind of internal management, responds, modulates, softens the signal slightly, makes the night a little more bearable than it would have been without any of this. There are several answers to this question, and they may all be partially correct. That's where the biology lands, honestly. Not on a single clean function, not on one elegant purpose that explains everything. The research, across decades, across cultures, across neuroscience and social psychology and evolutionary biology, converges on something more complicated and more interesting than a single answer. A cluster of functions, overlapping, mutually reinforcing, each one real, each one documented, none of them the whole story. So let's sit with the cluster. Nostalgia maintains the self across time. We've been through this. The medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the hippocampus running its integrative work, keeping the thread visible between who you were and who you are. The self is not given, it is produced. And nostalgia is one of the mechanisms of that production. One of the ways the brain keeps you coherent across all the cellular turnover and accumulated change and shifting weight of years. Nostalgia buffers against loneliness. The retrieved social memory, the warmth of a specific person, a specific belonging, a specific kind of being known, produces in the reward circuitry something close to the feeling of not being alone. Not identical, but close enough that the subjective experience of isolation decreases measurably after nostalgic recall. The past used as a social resource. The people you've known, living and dead, doing something for the present moment that they cannot do in person. Nostalgia modulates pain. The periaqueductal grey, the descending inhibition pathways, the endogenous systems built for managing nociceptive signal, these respond to the emotional warmth nostalgia generates. The threshold for what the body can bear shifts slightly. The night becomes slightly more manageable, not dramatically, enough. Nostalgia generates meaning. Clay Routledge and colleagues found this consistently. Nostalgic recall increases the sense that life contains significance, that what has happened matters, that the self exists within a story worth living. In moments when meaning feels thin or absent, the brain reaches backward, not randomly, but toward the memories that have proven most capable of restoring the sense that things add up to something. And nostalgia maintains physiological comfort. The body reaching for the memory of warmth when the room is cold, the nervous system simulating a previously experienced state of safety to buffer against a present state of discomfort. Homeostasis extended into the domain of memory. The past doing something for the body's physical chemistry, not just its emotional one. These are not separate functions operating independently. They are facets of the same underlying architecture. The same hippocampal VTA loop, the same amygdala encoding, the same dopaminergic reward signal, the same default mode network running its quiet maintenance. One mechanism producing multiple outputs, calibrated over a lifetime of experience to address multiple kinds of deficiency. What I keep arriving at, and I've been thinking about this since I stood outside that school gate a few weeks ago, since the memories came without asking, is that the brain did not build this system accidentally. The architecture is too specific, the functions too numerous and too well fitted to what human beings actually need. the social embedding of nostalgic memory, the selective preservation of warmth over negative detail, the dopaminergic calibration to adolescent encoding, the homeostatic reach for past physical comfort, the identity-maintaining function of the self-referential networks. These did not end up adjacent by coincidence. Something over the long history of nervous systems developing in social primates found this combination useful, found that a creature capable of mining its own past for warmth, for belonging, for pain modulation, for meaning, was better equipped to persist through present difficulty than one that could not. The ache is the cost of the architecture. You feel the gap because the system is working, because it learned something true and is presenting that truth to a present moment from which the original is absent. Because the encoding was real and the reward was real and the brain has been maintaining both across all the years between then and now, the sadness is evidence of the accuracy. I don't want to oversell this. I want to be careful here, actually, because I think the temptation with a finding like this, with the idea that nostalgia is functional, purposeful, useful, is to conclude that the feeling is therefore fine, that it doesn't need attending to, that the ache is just the system working, and so you should simply let it work and not worry about the weight of it on difficult evenings. That isn't quite right either. The system is useful and the system has limits. Both things are true. The function is real and the dysregulation is also real, in the people and the conditions where it occurs. The biology doesn't resolve the ambivalence, it just explains it, gives it a mechanism, shows you the circuitry so that when the feeling arrives, heavy or light, sweet or bitter, or genuinely both at the same time, you are not in the dark about what your nervous system is doing. Understanding doesn't dissolve the feeling, but it changes the company you keep while feeling it. You've been carrying something tonight. Not dramatically, just the particular weight of a mind that thinks about its past. The school gate, the bench, the grandfather's laugh, the bench with the friend who feels further away now, the cold evenings in a room that holds too much quiet. These are not abstract examples pulled from a database. They are real things from a real life, offered here because they are also your things in some form or another. Because nostalgia is universal in a way that almost nothing else is. Everybody has a bench. Everybody has a laugh they can still hear. Everybody has a version of themselves sitting somewhere specific, not yet knowing what the next decade would bring, that the hippocampus has been quietly maintaining across all the years since. The biology is the same, the archive differs, but the architecture, the reaching, the warmth, the ache, the simultaneous good and sad quality that has no cleaner name, that is shared. Across cultures, across centuries, documented in ancient literature long before Johannes Hofer put a name to it. Present in you, tonight, in this room, in the particular quality of stillness that this body settles into when the day is finally done. One more thing, and I want to say this carefully because I mean it specifically, not as a nicety. Some years from now, maybe many years, maybe not that many, you might be somewhere ordinary, doing something unremarkable, and something will catch the edge of a memory. A particular kind of quiet, a voice speaking slowly about biology in the dark. And your hippocampus, which has been maintaining what mattered with the same patient thoroughness it always has, will retrieve something from this period of your life, these nights, this channel, the specific quality of listening to something calm while the world outside was doing whatever it was doing. I might become part of your nostalgia. Not me exactly, but this, the texture of it, the particular feeling of lying in the dark with a voice explaining what your body is doing and why. That might get encoded, stored, maintained in tissue across years you haven't lived yet. And one evening it will surface, warm and slightly aching the way these things do, and you will recognize the feeling even if you can't quite place the source. The hippocampal VTA loop will do what it always does. The dopamine will move through pathways that learned in this period that this kind of quiet carried value. And somewhere in the circuitry, without any deliberate retrieval, this night will still be present. If this reached you, if any of it landed somewhere real, a like does something small but genuine. It tells whatever algorithm decides who sees this that the work is worth showing. And subscribing means you'll be here next time without having to go looking, which matters to me more than I usually say. If you want to keep this space alive in a more direct way, membership exists for that. And the comments, the ones where people say what they remember, what they're carrying, what bench they have, those are the ones I read slowly. I'm glad you are here tonight. I'm glad the school gate stopped me. I'm glad the brain does what it does. Sleep is already at the edges of this. You can probably feel it. The default mode network loosening its grip on narrative. The hippocampus beginning its nighttime work. The periaqueductal grey settling into its resting modulation. The anterior cingulate quieting. Everything that has been running. The retrieval, the reward signal, the self-referential processing, the emotional regulation, slowing now, handing over to the systems that manage the dark hours. The memories are in there, tended, warm, maintained across all the years they've been held. They'll be there in the morning. They've always been there.